So Tom Parker Bowles just got physically removed from a royal estate, and the part that actually matters isn't the removal itself. It's what happened on the phone call afterward, because that's where the entire illusion Camilla has been building for years just completely collapsed in front of a room full of witnesses. Here's what happened. While King Charles was out of the country, Tom Parker Bowles walked onto the Duchy of Cornwall, which is Prince William's territory, set up a full corporate gala, plugged his catering equipment into the estate's power supply, and threw the doors open like he personally owned the place. He even put up a crest that looked almost exactly like the royal crest but wasn't, just different enough to avoid a lawsuit. Guests noticed. Some of them couldn't figure out what was off about it, and others clocked it immediately and knew exactly what they were looking at. The word that came to mind was thief. Tom had been running this scheme for a while, just on a smaller scale. He'd bring corporate sponsors onto royal properties, collect money for access, and clear everything out before anyone official showed up. A palace staff member saw it happening, wrote it all down, filed a formal complaint, and that complaint made its way to Camilla's desk. Then it disappeared, gone. The person who filed it lost their job. Tom read that situation perfectly. His mother would cover for him, no matter how far he pushed it. And the senior people inside the palace, who knew the full picture, they stayed quiet because they understood that coming after Tom meant coming after Camilla, and coming after Camilla meant fire raining down on everything you had. So they looked away year after year while Tom got bolder. He started showing up at royal estate events without invitations, walking up to donors and investors, telling them he had influence over how royal properties were used. That was never true. That influence was never his to sell. But people believed him. They signed checks. They handed over money, thinking Tom Parker Bowles could get them inside the monarchy, and every penny went straight to him. When people complained, those complaints went nowhere. Some of them were pressured until they stopped. The beginning of the end came when Charles and Camilla left for the United States for that state visit. The moment the plane left the ground, Tom started hosting private dinners at the duchy, quietly testing how much room he had with no one looking. Then they came back, but Charles walked straight into the Chelsea Flower Show, completely wrapped up in that massive event with Alan Titchmarsh and David Beckham. Every lens in Britain was fixed on London. Tom looked at all that noise and decided no one with any real authority was watching what he was doing out in the countryside. That's when he planned the gala. William's office had the report within days, but William was in the middle of something delicate. He was deep in private talks with Charles about reshaping and modernizing the Crown estate, conversations built entirely on trust. If William had shown up personally to remove Camilla's son from the property, it would have become the loudest royal story in years and destroyed everything he'd spent months building with his father. So he made a smarter move. He called Prince Edward and handed over every legal right he held over the duchy, full administrative authority, the power to act without delay. He placed the entire weight of the Prince of Wales behind every decision Edward was about to make. Edward had spent his whole life watching this institution twist itself into shapes it was never meant to hold, just to keep one entitled man comfortable, a man who had never given a single day of actual service to any of it. When William put that power in his hands, he did not hesitate. Before we get into what happened when Edward walked through those doors, I want to take a quick second to ask you to subscribe to Crown Watch. We're covering every detail of this story and everything else happening inside the royal family, and subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you don't miss any of it. All right, let's get back into it. So the night of the gala, rain is hammering down outside. Inside the hall, Tom is gliding between his investors holding a glass of wine, completely at ease, like a man who believes this is his house, because as far as he's concerned...
For 689 years, the Duchy of Cornwall answered to almost no one. It was created in 1337 by Edward III to fund the heir to the English throne. And for nearly 7 centuries, it operated the way old institutions tend to operate, quietly, privately, and largely outside public scrutiny. Then, within the space of 2 years, Prince William inherited it. An ancient prison on its land became a national scandal, and the man who now controls one of Britain's oldest financial estates decided the old way of doing things was no longer good enough. This is the real story of what William has actually done with the Duchy of Cornwall, why it matters far more than any tabloid rumor, and where his mother's family, including Tom Parker Bowles, the Sun Queen Camilla, has spent decades protecting from public scrutiny, fits into a royal institution that is changing faster than most people realize. Start with what the Duchy of Cornwall actually is, because most people outside Britain, and plenty of people inside it, don't fully understand the mechanics. It is not a government department, and it is not the king's personal fortune. It is a private estate of land, farms, forests, and property spread across 23 counties in England and Wales, established specifically to give the monarch's eldest son financial independence without direct funding from the taxpayer. Since King Charles's accession in September 2022, that estate has belonged to Prince William, who now holds the title Duke of Cornwall alongside Prince of Wales. According to the Duchy's own integrated annual report, the estate generated a distributable surplus of roughly £22.9 million for the 2024-25 financial year, and William's more recent accounts show a private income of £21.6 million for 2025-26, on which he voluntarily paid £7.76 million in tax. The first time that figure has ever been made public. That single decision, to publish his tax bill at all, tells you something about the direction William is trying to push the institution in. His father, King Charles, has already become the first British monarch to publish his own tax filings. William, whether by personal instinct or by calculated strategy, is following that same path of visibility, and it is a sharp break from how the duchy conducted itself for generations. The bigger break came this year, when the duchy released its 2026 Integrated Impact Report and laid out a strategy that amounts to the most significant transformation of the estate in living memory. William's duchy plans to sell approximately 20% of its roughly £1 billion property portfolio over the next decade. Will Bax, the chief executive of the duchy, revealed the plan in an interview with the Times of London, describing a shift he called moving from stewardship to active leadership, using the duchy's land, capital, and partnerships to deliver social and environmental value alongside long-term financial sustainability. In practical terms, that means consolidating scattered holdings into 5 focus areas: Cornwall itself, the Isles of Scilly, Dartmoor, the area around Bath, and Kennington in South London, and reinvesting the proceeds into an announced $630 million 10-year investment plan. Part of that money is earmarked for building 2,500 new homes, 900 of them classified as affordable, at a moment when Britain's housing shortage is a genuine political flashpoint. Part of it is going toward a 20-year restoration plan for the Dartmoor landscape, peatland recovery work, and the expansion of duchy-managed Atlantic rainforest. Craig Prescott, a constitutional law expert at Royal Holloway, University of London, has described the land sale as exactly the kind of change for good William has been talking about publicly for years, even as the practical limits on that change remain very real. William, as Duke of Cornwall, is entitled to the duchy's operating profits, but constitutionally, he cannot sell property to personally benefit from the proceeds, and any large property transaction still requires government approval to protect the long-term value of the estate for future generations. In other words, William is reshaping the institution, but he is doing it inside a structure specifically designed to prevent any one royal from bending it entirely to his own will. That structure is exactly what makes the story of HMP Dartmoor so revealing, because it shows what happens when an old, opaque system collides with modern accountability. HMP Dartmoor is one of Britain's oldest prisons, built in 1806 originally to house prisoners of war from the Napoleonic conflict, and it has stood on Duchy of Cornwall land for more than 2 centuries. In July 2024, it was forced to close after radon gas, a colorless, odorless radioactive gas that is the United Kingdom's second leading cause of lung cancer after smoking, was found at levels up to 10 times the legal limit in parts of the building. Byline Times later revealed, through a Freedom of Information request, that elevated radon readings at Dartmoor had actually first been documented as far back as 2007, 17 years before the prison was finally evacuated. More than 400 inmates were moved out in the initial closure, and the number of people affected has continued to grow as investigators widen their inquiry. The Health and Safety Executive has since opened a criminal investigation into how prison leaders handled the situation, and roughly 750 former inmates and staff have joined a class action lawsuit against the Ministry of Justice, seeking compensation of at least £60,000 each for the exposure they say they suffered. The building itself remains empty, infested according to reporting in the Times with rats, birds, bats, and insects, and yet under the terms of a lease agreed in 2022, before William inherited the title of Duke of Cornwall, the Ministry of Justice continues paying the Duchy roughly £1.5 million a year in rent for a prison the public cannot use. Public Accounts Committee members told Parliament earlier this year that senior civil servants renewed that lease in what they described as a blind panic to preserve prison capacity, apparently while already aware of the radon problem. Since the closure, taxpayers have paid the Duchy an estimated £2.5 million and counting for an unusable building, with total costs over the life of the lease projected to reach as much as £68 million. It is worth sitting with just how unusual that level of scrutiny is for an institution like this one. For most of its history, the Duchy of Cornwall operated with almost no obligation to explain itself to anyone outside a small circle of trustees and government officials. Its finances were legally structured in a way that exempted it from corporation tax, on the basis that it is not considered a separate legal entity for tax purposes, and whatever income tax the Duke of Cornwall chose to pay on his earnings from the estate was, until very recently, entirely voluntary and entirely private. That combination of legal exemption and total discretion is precisely the kind of arrangement that tends to survive for centuries, specifically because no one in a position to change it has any incentive to. William, by choosing to publish figures he was never required to publish, is not closing a legal loophole. He cannot, on his own, rewrite 13th century property law, but he is closing an informational one, and in an era where royal finances face more public and journalistic pressure than at any point in decades, that distinction matters enormously to how the institution is perceived. This is where William's public relationship to the Duchy has genuinely shifted, rather than simply defending the arrangement or staying silent, as previous holders of the title arguably might have. William instructed the Duchy to remove the Dartmoor rental income from his personal accounts entirely and reinvest that money locally instead, while the prison's future remains unresolved. It is a small gesture in financial terms relative to his overall income, but symbolically it separates him from a controversy that predates his tenure and that he did not personally create, while the underlying lease, signed before he held the title, remains legally in force until 2033. The Duchy itself has publicly stated that the lease reflects a long-standing arrangement negotiated on a standard commercial basis, with both parties taking independent advice, and that it remains in regular contact with the Ministry of Justice as it decides Dartmoor's fate. Whether that response satisfies critics is a separate question from whether it is accurate, and reasonable people watching this story can disagree about how much responsibility a landlord bears for tenants who allegedly delayed acting on a known hazard. Now bring Tom Parker Bowles into this picture, because his real, documented public role is very different from the version of him that circulates in speculative royal content online. Tom Parker Bowles is Queen Camilla's eldest child from her first marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles, born in December 1974 and raised largely at Bullhyde Manor before being sent to prep school in Oxford. He has never held, and by his own repeated public statements has no interest in ever holding a royal title. Asked directly on Samuel Goldsmith's Good Food podcast whether he would want to be styled as a prince if his mother were queen, Parker Bowles said plainly that doing so would be, in his words, the fastest route to public backlash, adding that he believes Britain is a fairly balanced and sensible country, but that granting him a title would risk people showing up at the gates of Buckingham Palace in protest. That is not the language of a man angling for institutional power inside the monarchy. It is the language of someone who has built an entirely separate, independent career and prefers to keep it that way. Parker Bowles is, professionally, an accomplished food writer and restaurant critic, the author of 9 cookbooks, a Guild of Food Writers Award winner from 2010, the long-running restaurant critic for The Mail on Sunday, and a regular guest judge on BBC's MasterChef. His most recent book, Cooking in the Crown, Royal Recipes from Queen Victoria to King Charles III, released in 2024, is the first time in 2 decades of professional writing that he directly engaged with royal subject matter at all, and even then it was framed as a cookbook rather than a political statement. In interviews around that book's release, he has spoken candidly about his mother, including addressing, on the newsagent's podcast, why garlic and chili were deliberately kept off the coronation menu, explaining it came down to practical concerns about being close to large crowds of people rather than any grander symbolism. Parker Bowles has also more recently taken on a role that is less about food and more about protecting his mother's public image during moments of genuine vulnerability. When rumors began circulating about Queen Camilla's health following a bout of pneumonia, Parker Bowles addressed the speculation directly during an appearance on the Go to Food podcast, telling host Freddie Claude that his mother was recovering and dismissing suggestions of anything more serious as, in his words, no great conspiracy, just the kind of seasonal illness that goes around. That instinct to step in and calm speculation about his mother, using his own public platform rather than official palace channels, is consistent with how he has behaved for years. It is a notably modern approach to royal-adjacent life. Traditionally, family members connected to the monarchy who wanted to correct a false narrative relied on statements issued through Buckingham Palace or Clarence House, carefully worded by press officers and stripped of anything resembling a personal voice. Parker Bowles has instead built direct relationships with podcast hosts and food journalists over 2 decades, and when a moment calls for reassurance about his mother's health or a defense of her character, he simply goes on the shows where he already has credibility and speaks in his own words. It is a strategy that would have been unthinkable for a royal household a generation ago, and it says something about how the boundary between inside the institution and adjacent to the institution has softened over time, even as formal rules about titles and succession remain as rigid as ever. According to reporting from the South China Morning Post, he has previously defended Camilla publicly against allegations raised in Prince Harry's memoir Spare, pushing back on the characterization of his mother that emerged from that book. None of that amounts to financial control over royal institutions or any formal role inside the monarchy's structure. It is a son, with his own independent public profile, using that profile the way